Thanks for clicking! Ontario's attempt to combat the Trump tariffs via the Free Trade Within Canada Act, which received royal assent last week, has sparked concerns about competition coming from the real estate industry.
Do you ever think about me?
Yeah, there is a growing concern in the industry that the new legislation, designed to break down interprovincial trade barriers and promote free trade amongst the provinces, meant to boost economic growth against the threat of the Trump tariffs, could derail all of the great work the real estate industry has done at raising professional standards. Yeah, all jokes aside, momentarily, the industry is expressing a worry that realtors from other provinces, say from Nova Scotia or New Brunswick, will be able to apply to work in Ontario without having to take the proper licensing exams, potentially lowering the province's high standards. Which makes sense. After all, we wouldn't want those Nova Scotian realtors flooding into the market, making fun of our poor people for not being able to buy a home. That's for locally grown realtors only.
They took our jobs!
But while yes, we will have a bit of a laugh today as the self-made entrepreneurs have themselves a bit of a whine at the prospect of competition, the process of events, a backlash against free trade in the United States, followed by an attempt in Canada to mitigate against that backlash with more free trade, and a reactionary backlash stemming therefrom, points to the absurdity and politics unfolding before our eyes. So what I want to do today is very briefly go through the Protect Ontario Through Free Trade Within Canada Act, take a look at why the real estate industry hates it, and then discuss some implications. We have a big couple of weeks coming up ahead of us with Canada's national real estate data set to be released next Monday, and Canada's inflation data set to be released the week after, and we'll obviously have an update out on both of those on this channel. Make sure you click like and subscribe if you want to get those updates, but for now, let's get into free trade. Onto the Act. Very briefly, the Protect Ontario Through Free Trade Within Canada Act proposed the removal of 23 exemptions to the Canada Free Trade Agreement, including the requirement that real estate service providers reside in Ontario. And although we're still waiting to see how that bill will be implemented, its passage means that realtors from other provinces like Nova Scotia and New Brunswick will now be able to sell and buy homes here in Ontario without actually having to reside in the province. Real Estate Magazine noted prior to passage that this new bill could be a threat to current standards, with one realtor noting, "You're letting someone into a new province that has a whole different set of regulations and rules and different systems, and they're not trained on it yet." For example, says another realtor, there are very different customs across very different regions, noting once he got a personal check for a deposit, and the amount was a lot less than the 5% that is usually received.
Computer.
And yeah, that's massive. Can you imagine the training involved to teach those Nova Scotian realtors, A, not to take personal checks, and B, to make sure they're at least for 5%?
Can't teach how I do it.
But friends, it gets even worse. That same realtor finds himself imagining a situation where an out-of-province realtor had to manage a Toronto bidding war. It could be a real, quote, show. And yeah, can you imagine the mental strain it would take, the years of experience necessary needed to say, here's a house and go.
You just don't get it, do you?
Get over yourself. You're not lawyers, you're not doctors, you're not even car salesmen. The popular kids from high school in Nova Scotia are the same popular kids from high school in Ontario. Regardless, for their part, the Ontario Real Estate Association is calling on decision makers as they decide how all of this is going to be implemented to consider the Trust in Real Estate Services Act and Ontario's wider real estate industry. The legislation was approved last week and was tepidly welcomed by the TRREB, which noted it will work with the province, RICO, and OREA on implementing a model that balances workplace flexibility with consumer trust and regulatory oversight. And you know, we could take the scientific approach to this, outlining the absurdity of the stance being taken by these realtors, how it doesn't make any sense, how it doesn't match the facts, etc., in that Nova Scotia has real estate standards as well. They have a code of ethics, which I'm sure is flatly ignored out there just as much as it is here.
It better be.
But I don't think the backlash against this new legislation is really due to customer standards. It's because the industry doesn't want the competition, which they said as much in the interview with Real Estate Magazine, noting that they don't want hungrier agents taking advantage of working in Ontario. which is incredibly ironic as it gets to the heart of what's going on right now. Backlashes against the dislocations brought on by free trade. Any border limiting trade is artificial. Right now, the president is trying to erect them, putting tariffs on our steel so U.S. steel manufacturers don't have to compete with the comparative advantage held by Canadian steel manufacturers. It's a backlash against the Ricardian model of free trade, a theory of comparative advantage outlined in the early 19th century. Ricardo argued that if Portugal specialized in making wine and England specialized in making cloth, then both would benefit from trade with one another. They both do well from specialization. But while Portugal may have been better off, that doesn't mean that the cloth manufacturers in Portugal were better off right away. Those cloth manufacturers which had been benefiting from artificial barriers to trade that Portugal had put up against England. Right now, the US wants those barriers, those protections put back in place, while Ontario, in an attempt to boost its efficiency, boost its relative economic growth, is hoping to remove those barriers, those protections, hoping that it will, on net, gain in the efficiencies brought on by free trade amongst the provinces. But just like the auto workers in the United States got hurt by the implementation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, there are going to be similar dislocations brought on by our own implementation of free trade Canada-wide. But the idea, the hope anyway, is that Ontario Realtors will now be able to work in New Brunswick, that Ontario will be able to sell its goods restrictions-free to Nova Scotia. And really we should, as articulated in the Globe and Mail, which went over an interesting example on the Ricardian notion of free trade. Say Tom Brady's neighbor offers to mow Tom Brady's lawn, and although Brady could mow his own lawn, he might even be better at it given his athleticism, he's still better off playing football. He'll make far more money per time worked than he would mowing lawn playing football, and the gardener is better off too, as of course he gets a job. Both are better off doing what they do best because of comparative advantage. And that's what Ontario is hoping for by the removal of all these barriers, by the removal of all these protections, that in gaining access to these other markets, it will gain on net from that comparative advantage. So, in summary, just as Canada tries to mitigate U.S. protectionism with its own free trade push, we're seeing a U.S.-style backlash against that push, with Ontario Realtors calling for continued protectionism. That same industry that very much benefited from free trade with the United States, the ever-increasing GDP, the ultra-low inflation, which enabled ultra-low interest rates. That same industry is now lamenting that free trade coming to its own shores.
I'm trying to protect you.
Which isn't at all a criticism of realtors, or the industry for that matter, though their rhetorical prowess, or lack thereof, reveals why they need to have their money printed for them, but rather it points to what we've been talking about, which is politics, which is who gets what and how much. Where you sit is very much where you stand. What we're seeing on the global scale between the United States and most everyone else, or between the United States and Canada, as President Trump articulates the U.S. backlash against free trade, as those dislocations created by that free trade bubble up into national policy, we're seeing a microcosm of that play out in Ontario. With that said, this bill was just passed last week. How it will be implemented still remains to be seen, but we will obviously continue to track how all of this works out on this channel. Make sure you click like and subscribe if you want to get those updates, but for now, thanks so much for watching.